History isn't just about dates and names. It's about the stories, decisions, and people that shape the world we live in today. On Deep Dive, we explore fascinating events, legendary figures, forgotten moments, and the questions that make history so interesting. Whether you're a history buff or just love a good story, grab a seat and join the conversation as we take a deep dive into the past, one episode at a time.
It's a real privilege to be here. I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, I am too. Because if you're listening right now, I want you to just imagine an empire so remarkably advanced that its scientists actually had a functional earthquake detector.
Right, yeah.
And we're talking about 2,000 years ago. But then imagine that same sprawling, hyper-advanced civilization just completely tearing itself apart from the inside.
Just a total systemic collapse.
Exactly, collapsing into this brutal century of warlords that would wipe out tens of millions of lives. So for you listening, our mission today is to unpack a massive stack of historical texts covering the Han Dynasty.
Yeah, the rise and the catastrophic fall.
Right. And then the legendary Three Kingdoms period that emerged from those ashes. And finally, we're going to look at a 14th century novel that just completely rewired how the modern world remembers all of this.
It really did. And, to set the stage for everyone, the timeline we were looking at stretches from 202 BC all the way to 280 AD.
That is a massive chunk of time.
It is. But the cultural ripples from this era, they are still actively shaping East Asia today. You really cannot understand the sheer anarchy of the Three Kingdoms without first establishing the towering scale of what was lost.
Right, because we aren't just talking about a government falling.
No, we are talking about the architectural foundation of an entire civilization.
Which brings us directly to the Han Dynasty, because reading through these sources, it feels like this specific dynasty is the ghost that just haunted China for centuries after it fell.
Oh, absolutely.
So what made it so important? What made the Han so uniquely foundational compared to everything else?
Well, you have to consider the aftermath of the Qin Dynasty. That's the one that immediately preceded the Han. Okay.
Now, the Qin was the first to actually unify China, but it was highly authoritarian, notoriously brutal, and it collapsed almost immediately after the death of its founder.
So it was just a flash in the pan, basically.
Right. So when this man named Liu Bang emerged from the resulting civil war to establish the Han Dynasty in 22 BC, he didn't just conquer territory.
What did he do?
His administration managed to synthesize a totally new political and cultural reality.
Right.
So the Han era is divided into two halves. You have the Western Han, centered in Chang'an, and then later the Eastern Han, operating out of Luoyang.
Okay, got it.
But across those 4 centuries, they essentially forged a unified identity out of all these disparate warring states.
Yeah, and the sources actually mention that the majority ethnic group in modern China today still calls themselves the Han people.
Yes, exactly.
And the writing system is referred to as Han characters, which, it seems almost incomprehensible to me. A government from 2 millennia ago successfully branded an entire civilization's ethnic and linguistic identity down to the present day. It is staggering when you really think about it.
How did they achieve that level of cultural buy-in? How do you get millions of people to agree to that?
Well, they achieved it through just unprecedented stability and institutional standardization. So the Han administration formalized a civil service system based on Confucian principles.
Meaning what exactly for the average person?
It meant that government officials were increasingly chosen for merit and education rather than just pure aristocratic bloodlines. And they standardized laws, weights, measures, even infrastructure across a geography that's roughly the size of Europe.
Wow, so everyone is operating on the exact same system.
Right. When people living within those borders experienced hundreds of years of shared economic prosperity, agricultural growth, and this unified administrative culture,
they just stopped seeing themselves as outsiders.
Exactly. They stopped seeing themselves as citizens of their former local kingdoms, and they started seeing themselves as people of the Han.
And that prosperity funded some staggering technological leaps. Going through the text, they mentioned papermaking, which, fundamentally changes how a government manages data.
Oh, it changes everything.
They had the invention of ship rudders for complex navigation, and even the application of negative numbers in mathematics.
Yeah, the math advancements were incredible.
But the 2 inventions that made me literally stop reading and just stare at the wall were the hydraulic-powered armillary spheres and the seismometer.
Ah, Zhang Heng's inventions, yes.
Let's talk about the armillary spheres first. Because for anyone listening who isn't an ancient astronomer, what are we actually looking at here?
So an armillary sphere is essentially a physical model of the cosmos. Think of it as these nested metal rings representing the celestial equator, the ecliptic path of the sun, and the orbits of the planets.
Okay, so like a giant metal globe of the sky.
Right. But what makes the Han version, which was developed by the polymath Zhang Heng, so incredible is the hydraulic-powered aspect.
That's the part that blew my mind.
Yeah, so they engineered a water clock, a clepsydra, to provide this constant, perfectly regulated drip of water.
Yeah.
And this water turned a highly complex system of gears. And those gears slowly rotated the massive bronze rings of the armillary sphere in perfect synchronization with the actual rotation of the night sky.
So they basically built an analog computer,
Yeah.
like powered by plumbing, to track the universe in real time.
Exactly. Wait, actually, I shouldn't just agree with that. It's actually more profound than an analog computer
How so?
because it was a tool of statecraft. You see, in ancient Chinese cosmology, the emperor was the son of heaven.
Right.
His legitimacy rested on the mandate of heaven. Therefore, accurately predicting celestial events like eclipses or planetary alignments, it wasn't just abstract science.
With political propaganda.
It was proof. Proof that the state was in perfect harmony with the cosmos.
That is wild, which perfectly sets up the seismometer. Because this was also invented by Zhang Heng, right?
Yeah.
132 AD.
Yes, that's right.
The visual description in the sources is just, it's wild. It's a massive bronze vessel, maybe 6 feet across, decorated with 8 dragons facing outward in the 8 cardinal directions.
Yeah, it was a beautiful piece of art as much as a machine.
And below each dragon sits a bronze toad with its mouth wide open. But okay, how does this thing actually detect an earthquake hundreds of miles away? And how does it not get triggered by, I don't know, a heavy cart rolling down the street outside the palace?
Well, the genius lies in the internal mechanism. Historians believe it was an inverted pendulum.
An inverted pendulum, like balancing a broom on your hand.
Yes, exactly like that. Imagine a heavy pillar balanced delicately inside the urn. Because it's an inverted pendulum, its center of mass is high up.
Okay.
That makes it highly sensitive to a very specific type of seismic wave long-distance lateral tremors. But it remains mostly inert to local high-frequency vibrations like that passing cart you mentioned.
Oh, wow. So the inertia of the heavy pillar basically keeps it still while the ground and the vessel move around it.
Yes. So when a distant earthquake occurs, the vessel shakes, causing that internal pillar to tilt. When it tilts, it engages a complex system of levers.
And that drops the ball.
Exactly. It opens the jaw of the specific dragon facing the direction of the earthquake's epicenter. A small bronze ball drops into the mouth of the toad waiting below.
With a massive clang, I
A
assume.
very loud clang. So the imperial court could hear that clang, walk over, look at which dragon dropped the ball, and instantly know that a disaster had struck, say, to the northwest.
That is just brilliant. I mean, they are instantly dispatching military aid or grain supplies to a region before a human messenger even has time to saddle a horse and ride to the capital.
It perfectly demonstrates the mindset of the Han administration. They weren't merely observing the natural world, you know? They were actively engineering massive systems to manage a colossal empire.
Right.
And that ambition extended far beyond their borders. It ended up reshaping global economics in the process.
Well, let's follow that economic thread, because I want to talk about Zhang Qian. He was an imperial envoy sent west by the Han court.
Yes, a very famous figure.
The sources detail these wild diplomatic missions he undertook into Central Asia. He made contact with places like Dayuan, which is modern for Ghana, I think,
Correct.
and he brought back intelligence on the Parthian Empire and the Indus River Valley. Honestly, I look at Zhang Qian's journey as the booting up of the ancient internet.
That's a fun way to put it.
Yeah, like he plugged China's closed network into a massive continental server, and that paved the way for the Silk Road.
Absolutely. And we really should recognize the sheer physical danger of what Zhang Qian did, because he wasn't just taking a casual diplomatic tour.
No, she got captured, right?
He did. On his first mission, he was captured by the Xiongnu. They were this massive nomadic confederation to the north of China, and they held him hostage for 10 years.
A 10-year hostage situation. That is unbelievable.
It gets crazier. He married, had a child, and eventually escaped. But instead of running home, he continued his mission westward. He was completely dedicated to the emperor's original orders.
So he spent a decade as a prisoner and still said, well, back to work.
Exactly. And when he finally returned to Chang'an, the geographic intelligence he provided was a total revelation. It proved to the Han court that there were complex, wealthy civilizations to the west that actually desired Chinese goods.
So you have this sudden, massive influx of globalization. Roman glassware starts making its way into China, and Chinese silk finds its way to the Mediterranean.
Right.
But maintaining those trade routes, and specifically defending them from the Xiongnu, that couldn't have been cheap.
It was astronomically expensive.
The sources mention early Han emperors trying to appease the Xiongnu with tribute and marriage alliances, but eventually the policy just completely shifts under Emperor Wu.
Yes, Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 BC. He decided the appeasement strategy was just a humiliating failure.
So he went on the offensive.
He did. He launched a series of aggressive, expansive military campaigns deep into the northern steppes to break the Xiongnu's power and secure the trade routes once and for all.
But okay, war at that scale requires an absurd amount of cash. How do you finance a continental war in an agrarian society without just taxing the peasant farmers into a violent revolt?
Well, you take over the most lucrative private industries. Emperor Wu implemented a sweeping series of economic policies that effectively nationalized the commanding heights of the Han economy.
So the state takes control.
Total control. The state established absolute monopolies on the production of salt and iron, as well as the minting of coins and eventually even the brewing of liquor.
Okay, let's break that down. Because monopolizing iron makes perfect sense. You need weapons for the army. But how does an ancient government monopolize salt? What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, back then, salt was largely produced by boiling seawater or brine from deep wells using these massive iron pans. Before Emperor Wu, wealthy private merchants controlled this process. They employed thousands of peasants and accumulated fortunes that literally rivaled the state's treasury.
So the emperor didn't like the competition.
Not at all. Emperor Wu essentially criminalized private salt production. The government simply took over the salt pans and the brine wells.
Just seized
Seized them, and then they forced the former salt merchants to become government bureaucrats managing the operations on behalf of the state.
Wow. So if you were just a commoner, a regular farmer?
If you were a commoner, you suddenly had to buy your salt, which, remember, is an absolute biological necessity for preserving food and human survival. You had to buy it directly from government agencies at fixed, heavily inflated prices.
Wow. It's a hidden tax. They're literally funding a massive war machine every single time a peasant preserves a fish.
Exactly. And the iron monopoly was even more deeply felt by the average person. The state took over the foundries. So instead of local blacksmiths producing custom, high-quality agricultural tools for their neighbors, the government began mass-producing standard-issue iron plows and tools.
Let me guess. The quality dropped.
The quality plummeted and the prices skyrocketed. But the revenue generated for the state was astronomical. It funded Emperor Wu's vast military expansions and allowed the Han to project power deep into Central Asia.
Okay, so this brings us to a massive contradiction. And honestly, it's the pivot point of our deep dive today.
Right.
We have just described a superpower. I mean, they have earthquake detectors, they have the Silk Road, they have state-controlled monopolies funneling limitless wealth to the military, and they're managing tens of millions of citizens.
It's a behemoth.
So how does an empire with all those advantages and that much centralized power completely fall apart?
Well, it rarely happens overnight, and it almost never happens solely because of an outside invasion.
It's an inside job.
Yeah, empires of this magnitude, they rot from the inside out. The structural integrity fails first, usually at the very top of the political pyramid, and then an environmental crisis comes along and just kicks the door in.
Okay, so if we're looking for the internal rot, the sources point directly at the imperial court during the Eastern Han period.
Yes.
There is this vicious, frankly, repetitive cycle of violence between two factions, the palace eunuchs and the consort clans. Now, for a listener who might not be familiar with ancient palace politics, can you explain why these two specific groups were fighting to the death over the government?
It all stems from the biological realities of dynastic succession. The emperor, of course, had an empress and numerous consorts.
Right.
When an emperor died young, which happened frequently during the Eastern Han, he often left behind an infant heir. The mother of that infant, the Empress Dowager, would suddenly become the regent. She acted as the ultimate authority until the child came of age.
And naturally, she brings her own male relatives into the government.
Yes. Her brothers, her uncles, this is what we call the consort clan, would be appointed to the highest military and civil posts. They would effectively rule the empire.
Okay.
But eventually, that infant grows up, he becomes a teenager, and he looks around and realizes he has no actual power.
His mom's family is running the show.
Exactly. His mother's family is controlling everything and completely isolating him.
But who can he turn to? I mean, he can't reach out to the military generals because his uncles control them, right?
Right. So he turns to the only men allowed inside his private inner living quarters, the palace eunuchs.
No.
These were castrated male servants. And from the emperor's perspective, eunuchs were the ultimate trustworthy allies. Because they could not father children, they couldn't start a rival dynasty.
Their power was totally dependent on him.
Entirely. Their entire wealth and status derived directly from the emperor's favor. So the teenage emperor would secretly conspire with his eunuchs to stage a violent coup, assassinate the consort clan, and reclaim the throne.
But then, wait, then the eunuchs are the ones holding the actual power.
Precisely. And they would absolutely use that power to enrich their own adopted families and exact revenge on the scholars and officials who despise them.
That's terrible. So
It gets worse.
Yeah.
Because then that emperor would die young.
Oh, no.
A new infant would take the throne. A new empress dowager would appoint a new consort clan. They would purge the eunuchs, and the bloody pendulum would swing all over again.
So the central government was essentially just paralyzed by these endless palace massacres.
Totally paralyzed.
And this political dysfunction wasn't just a late Eastern Han problem, right?
Yep.
We need to rewind slightly to look at a massive disruption that happened right in the middle of the dynasty, around 9 AD.
Yes, the Xin interruption.
Right, when a regent named Wang Mang just completely usurped the throne and established his own brief Xin dynasty.
Wang Mang is a fascinating case study in just how vulnerable the system was. He was a member of a powerful consort clan who managed to seize ultimate power. And once he was on the throne, he implemented incredibly radical reforms.
Like what?
Well, he recognized that wealthy aristocrats had bought up all the farmland, which was forcing peasants into tenant farming or outright slavery. So Wang Mang attempted to nationalize all land, redistribute it equally, and abolish the slave trade entirely.
I mean, on paper, to a modern ear, that sounds incredibly progressive.
It does sound progressive, but in practice, he completely alienated the powerful land-owning bureaucracy, and he actually needed them to run the empire.
Right, you can't run the country if the people running it hate you.
Exactly. The wealthy families resisted him at every turn, but what ultimately doomed Wang Mang wasn't his tax policy.
It was the river,
It was the Yellow River.
the environmental disaster. The texts detail these catastrophic floods in 3 AD and 11 AD. How does a river flood bring down an entire dynasty?
The Yellow River is infamous for carrying massive amounts of silt-like fine sand and dirt from the Loess Plateau. Over decades, this silt settles on the riverbed, gradually raising the bottom of the river.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
Yeah, to keep the water contained, the government constantly had to build higher and higher earthen dikes. By Wang Mang's time, the river was essentially flowing on a raised aqueduct high above the surrounding plains.
That sounds like a literal ticking time bomb.
It was. And when the political administration degraded to the point that they stopped properly maintaining those dikes, the bomb went off.
The dikes broke.
The massive dikes breached. And the entire Yellow River literally split and shifted its course hundreds of miles to the south, emptying into the sea at a completely different location.
I mean, if you are a farmer living on the North China Plain at that moment, that isn't just a bad storm. That is the end of the world. Millions of acres of crops are just gone in an instant.
It displaced hundreds of thousands, if not millions of peasants. They were starving, their homes were gone, and Wang Mang's paralyzed government offered zero relief.
Zero.
None. So those displaced farmers formed massive roaming bands just to survive, and those bands evolved into organized rebellions.
The sources mention the Red Eyebrows.
Yes, the most famous group. They were named because they literally painted their foreheads and eyebrows red to distinguish themselves in battle. The sheer scale of this chaos just completely overwhelmed Wang Mang's armies.
So they just overthrew him.
An insurgent mob eventually breached his palace in Cheng, killed him, and essentially allowed a new branch of the Liu family to step in and restore the Han dynasty.
But the real tragedy here is that the restored Eastern Han clearly did not learn the lessons of Wang Mang's fall.
Not at all.
Because if we fast forward to the late 2nd century, under the reigns of Emperor Huan and Emperor Ling, the exact same conditions are brewing again.
It's history repeating itself. The eunuchs are extorting the provinces, there's widespread famine, and massive plagues are sweeping the population.
And out of this misery emerges the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 AD.
It is the breaking point for the empire. The government is entirely absent in terms of providing public welfare, but highly present in terms of demanding taxes.
Right. And the sources mention a man named Zhang Zhao leading this rebellion, preaching a Taoist movement called the Way of Supreme Peace. Now, I have to step in here and ask about the framing.
Sure.
For a listener who isn't steeped in Chinese religious history, what does that mean? Was the Yellow Turban Rebellion just a radical, opportunistic religious cult taking advantage of the chaos? Or was it a predictable, desperate peasant uprising against a corrupt 1% hoarding all the wealth?
Well, the religious ideology was the framework, absolutely. But the fuel was entirely socioeconomic desperation. I mean, imagine you are a peasant in 184 AD.
Okay.
Your crops have failed. A devastating plague is killing your neighbors. The local magistrate is a corrupt official who bought his post by bribing a palace eunuch, and he's demanding taxes you simply cannot pay.
Yeah.
The state offers nothing but violence.
So you have absolutely nothing left to lose.
Nothing. You are going to die anyway. And then Zhang Zhao arrives in your village. He isn't demanding taxes. He is offering a message of radical equality.
And healing, right?
Yes, he uses traditional Taoist medicinal practices to try and heal the sick during this massive plague. He tells you that the blue heaven of the Han is dead, and the yellow heaven of a new, just world is rising.
Wow.
For an impoverished farmer, Zhang Zhao's movement provided an alternative social safety net and a community when the state had completely abandoned them. That is why hundreds of thousands of people tied yellow cloths around their heads and took up arms.
And the cure the Han court applies to stop the yellow turbans ends up being worse than the disease itself.
Far worse.
To crush this massive decentralized peasant revolt, the central government realizes it doesn't have the manpower. So they empower regional governors and local magistrates to raise their own private massive armies.
They outsourced the military monopoly of the state.
Which is suicidal for a centralized empire. Because once the yellow turbans are defeated, those generals don't just politely disband their armies and go back to doing paperwork.
Of course not.
They realize they have the power now. Which leads us directly to the spark that blows up the Han dynasty for good. Dongzhuo.
Yes, it is 189 AD. Emperor Ling dies, leaving behind a young heir. And the capital of Luoyang immediately descends into a horrific bloodbath as the military officers and the consort clans finally decide to physically exterminate the palace eunuch faction.
They just wipe them out.
Over 2,000 eunuchs are slaughtered inside the palace walls.
And while the capital is literally tearing itself apart, Dongzhuo, who is a battle-hardened frontier military general, sees the smoke.
He sees his opportunity.
He marches his massive battle-tested army right into Luoyang and just seizes de facto control of the entire government. He deposes the young Emperor Shao and installs his own puppet, the 8-year-old Emperor Xian.
Dongzhuo represents the total collapse of the civil order. He didn't just manipulate the political system, he brutally replaced it with martial law.
And then a coalition forms to stop it, right?
Yes, when a coalition of Eastern warlords formed to challenge his illegitimate control, Dongzhuo made a strategic but devastating decision.
He burned the city.
He looted the ancient capital of Luoyang, burned it entirely to the ground, and forced the young emperor and millions of civilians to march hundreds of miles west to the heavily fortified mountain passes of Chang'an.
The visual of Luoyang, I mean, the economic and cultural center of the empire, a city that rivaled Rome going up in flames, is just chilling.
It was apocalyptic.
With the capital in ruins and the emperor held hostage by a warlord, the illusion of Han authority evaporated instantly. The regional governors looked around at the smoke and realized no one is coming to save us.
The center cannot hold.
Exactly. And that realization is the genesis of the warlord era. The regional governors, the military generals, and the powerful local aristocrats had to look to their own survival.
Right, the survival instinct kicks in.
We mentioned the coalition formed to stop Dongzhuo, featuring powerful figures like Yuan Shao, Yuan Shu, and a highly ambitious rising star named Cao Cao. But this coalition fractures almost immediately.
Almost overnight.
I look at the situation, I think of it like rogue franchise managers.
Rogue franchise manager.
Now, how do you mean? So imagine a massive corporate chain of stores across the country. Suddenly, the corporate headquarters burns down, and the CEO is taken hostage by a rogue security guard.
Okay, I follow.
The regional managers form a committee to save the company. But then they look at their own local stores, their local supply chains, and their local profits. And they realize, wait a minute, I don't need corporate anymore. I'm just going to keep these stores for myself.
Right.
And actually, since there's no oversight, I'm going to take my employees across the street and violently take over the rival manager stores, too.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it, honestly, because it perfectly captures the shift in motivation.
Yeah.
The primary goal for these warlords shifted overnight from restore the Han Dynasty to consolidate local military power and survive. The North China Plain descended into a complete battle royale.
Just every man for himself.
Warlords absorbed weaker neighbors, forged and broke alliances, and built independent fiefdoms. And through sheer military brilliance and political pragmatism, Cao Cao eventually emerges as the dominant force in the north.
And crucially, he gains control of the figurehead Emperor Xian, right?
Yes, using the emperor to legitimize his own conquests.
So Cao Cao wants to reunify the entire empire, which leads to the defining geopolitical clash of the era. The Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 AD.
The famous Battle of Red Cliffs.
Cao Cao marches a massive, battle-hardened northern army down to the Yangtze River with the goal of crushing the southern warlords. But two southern leaders, Liu Bei and Sun Quan, realize they have to team up to survive.
Yes. And you have to remember, the Yangtze River is the great natural divide of China. Cao Cao's troops were northerners. They were masters of cavalry and infantry warfare on open plains.
But they were on water.
Right. They were not accustomed to naval warfare on a massive, turbulent river. And a significant portion of his army fell violently ill with disease in the southern swamps.
The sources outline a very specific tactical blunder here. Because his men were violently seasick on the riverboats, Cao Cao ordered his fleet to be chained together.
Yes, to stabilize the decks.
Thinking it would let his infantry fight on the water as if it were dry land.
It stabilized the ships, but it completely destroyed their mobility. The Southern Alliance, led by Sun Quan's commander Zhu Yu, recognized this fatal flaw immediately.
And they took advantage.
They loaded a vanguard of ships with dry reeds, poured oil over them, set them on fire, and sailed them directly into Cao Cao's chained fleet.
Just kamikaze fire ship.
Exactly. The wind shifted, blowing the fire ships right into the Northern Armada. Because the ships were chained together, they couldn't scatter. The entire fleet burned, handing Cao Cao a devastating defeat.
Why does this specific battle matter so much in the grand scheme of things?
Because Red Cliffs guaranteed a tripartite stalemate. Cao Cao's defeat meant his northern army would never have the naval capability to cross the Yangtze and conquer the south.
And the South couldn't go north.
Exactly. The southern warlords, Liu Bei and Sun Quan, did not have the cavalry or the population density to push north and conquer Cao Cao's heartland. Red Cliffs basically drew the borders of the three kingdoms in blood.
But before we dig into those specific kingdoms, we really have to pause and look at the human cost of this transition from the Han to the warlords.
Yeah.
It's truly apocalyptic.
Numbers are staggering.
According to the sources, the Han Dynasty at its peak registered over 56.4 million individuals in its census. But when the country is finally reunified in 280 AD, the census records just over 16.1 million individuals.
A drop of 40 million people over a century.
Wait, hold on. I have to challenge that number. 40 million people. That's the population of a modern European country like Spain or Ukraine. How is it physically possible for a death toll that high not to wipe out the civilization entirely? Are those numbers actually real?
Well, the numbers require context. Ancient census methods were inherently tied to taxation. During a century of total war, the government's ability to count peasants completely breaks down.
So they weren't all dead.
No, millions of people weren't dead. They simply fled the violence of the North China Plain, migrating into the deep, unmapped south where the census takers just couldn't find them.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, millions more willingly took their names off the government tax rolls to become undocumented serfs for wealthy local warlords.
Okay, so a lot of it is administrative disappearance.
A significant portion, yes. But we cannot sanitize the reality of the era. Even factoring in those administrative discrepancies, the physical death toll from continuous warfare, mass famines caused by destroyed agriculture, and sweeping infectious diseases was catastrophic.
Just a living nightmare.
Entire cities were emptied, large swaths of productive farmland returned to wilderness. The psychological trauma on the surviving population was immeasurable.
It's sobering. So the dust from Red Cliffs settles over a completely broken society, and the map is officially redrawn. The Three Kingdoms era officially begins.
Yes, the three states.
Let's look closely at these three distinct states that emerged from the ashes. We have Cao Wei in the north, Shu Han in the west, and Eastern Wu in the south. Let's start with the dominant player, Cao Wei.
Cao Wei was the undisputed economic and demographic powerhouse. It was officially founded in 220 AD when Cao's son, Cao Pai, finally forced the puppet Emperor Xian to abdicate.
So that ends the Han Dynasty in name as well as fact.
Exactly. Wei controlled the traditional heartland of China, the north, which possessed the most developed agricultural infrastructure and the largest population center.
The sources mention a specific governmental innovation in Wei called the nine-rank system, developed by a minister named Chen Quan. On paper, it sounds like an HR system, a way to classify civil servants into 9 ranks based on their talent.
On paper, yes.
But reading between the lines and knowing what we just discussed about wealthy families, was this just institutionalized nepotism?
It was absolutely institutionalized nepotism disguised as a meritocracy, and it fundamentally altered Chinese society for centuries.
How did it actually work?
The critical flaw or design feature, depending on your perspective, was that local aristocrats were appointed to act as the rectifiers, the judges evaluating the talent of young men in their provinces.
So the rich are grading the rich.
Naturally, a wealthy local lord is going to give the highest ranks to the sons of other wealthy, connected families, while commoners were systematically given the lowest ranks or ignored entirely.
What does that actually mean for a common farmer in Wei?
It means the creation of a rigid, hereditary caste system. The highest ranks were monopolized by a few elite families, and those high ranks came with massive privileges, most notably exemption from taxes and conscript labor.
Which means the entire tax burden of funding Wei's massive armies falls on the poorest people.
Yes, and the poor simply couldn't survive it. To escape the crushing taxes of the central government, commoners would legally bind themselves to these wealthy, noble families.
They gave up their freedom.
They became private clients. They lived in fortress villages owned by the aristocracy, worked the lord's land, and served in the lord's private militia. They didn't pay taxes to the state. They handed over 50% or more of their harvest to their local lord.
That sounds exactly like medieval European feudalism. The state of Wei looks incredibly strong on a map, but internally, the central government is being hollowed out by its own nobility.
Precisely the dynamic. Now, contrast that northern reality with what was happening in the geographic margins, specifically the southwest.
Right, which brings us to the state of Shuhan, located in the Sichuan Basin. This state was founded by Liu Bei in 221 AD, with its capital at Chengdu.
A very different kind of state.
Yeah, Shu's entire identity was built on an ideology of legitimacy. Liu Bei was a distant, impoverished relative of the Han imperial clan. So when the Han officially fell, he claimed that his state wasn't a new warlord faction, but the unbroken, legitimate continuation of the Han dynasty itself.
And the defining characteristic of Shuhan was its extreme geography. The Sichuan Basin is incredibly fertile. It's an agricultural paradise, but it is surrounded by punishing, nearly impassable mountain ranges.
So it's basically a bunker.
It made Shuhan a fortress. It was incredibly easy to defend against northern invasions, but it made projecting power outward almost impossible.
Which is the tragedy of Liu Bei's legendary chancellor and military strategist, Zhuge Liang. He was obsessed with restoring the Han, which meant he had to invade Wei.
He led these massive northern campaigns, trying to march armies out of the mountains.
But the logistics of moving food through those passes were so brutal that the sources say Zhuge Liang actually invented something called the wooden ox.
Yes. And historians largely agree the wooden ox was an early form of the wheelbarrow.
Stop right there. A wheelbarrow. How does a garden tool change the logistics of a continental war?
Well, think about the physics of transportation in an ancient army. Before the wheelbarrow, if you couldn't use carts because the mountain paths were too narrow and steep, you relied on human porters.
Right.
Carrying grain on their backs or with shoulder poles. A human porter consumes a massive amount of the very food he is carrying just to survive the journey.
So you're eating the supplies you're supposed to deliver.
Exactly. The wheelbarrow places the center of gravity of the load directly over the wheel. It acts as a mechanical force multiplier. It allows a single man to push hundreds of pounds of grain up a narrow mountain plank road with a fraction of the physical exertion. It was a brilliant engineering solution to a geographic nightmare.
Even if it still wasn't enough to overcome Wei's massive resource advantage.
Right. It helped, but Wei was just too big.
That is fascinating. And then we have the third player, Eastern Wu, occupying the south and east along the Yangtze River.
Yes, the naval power.
Sun Quan declares independence in 222 AD and officially proclaims himself emperor in 229 AD, establishing his capital in what is now Nanjing. Wu's survival depended entirely on its naval supremacy on the Yangtze, but its history is heavily defined by a massive paradigm-shifting betrayal.
The breaking of the Shu-Wu alliance.
Yeah. During the lead-up to the official three-way split, Liu Bei's most legendary general, a man named Guan Yu, was tasked with guarding Jing province.
And Jing was the most highly strategic territory in the empire because it sat right in the middle, bordering all three factions. It was the gateway to the Yangtze.
And Sun Quan, the ruler of Wu, felt that Liu Bei had essentially borrowed that territory and refused to give it back.
Exactly. Sun Quan grew increasingly paranoid that Shu was becoming too powerful. So, while Guan Yu marched his army north to wage a massive campaign against Wei, Sun Quan made a secret, unthinkable pact with his sworn enemy, Cao Cao.
He switched sides.
He sent his most brilliant general, Lu Meng, to launch a stealth attack down the Yangtze River.
How do you stealth attack down a massive river? Like, they didn't have submarines.
Lu Meng supposedly disguised his elite naval troops as civilian merchants. They sailed right past Guan Yu's river watchtowers, infiltrated the defenses, and seized Jing province without a massive battle.
Just snuck right in.
Guan Yu, cut off from his base and surrounded by enemies on two fronts, was captured and executed by Sun Quan's forces.
That betrayal fundamentally altered the psychology of the era. I mean, it ensured that Shu and Wu could never fully trust each other again, meaning they could never coordinate a unified assault to destroy Wei. They were perpetually watching their backs. So how does this century of bloodshed actually resolve? You'd assume one of these three famous warlord families, the Cao, the Liu, or the Sun, eventually conquers the others and wins the Game of Thrones.
And that is the ultimate irony of the Three Kingdoms period. None of them win.
Wait, none of them?
None of them. In 263 AD, the powerhouse of Wei finally launches a massive invasion and conquers the mountain state of Shu, whose leadership had decayed significantly under Liu Bei's incompetent son.
Okay, so Wei wins.
No, because the Cao family of Wei doesn't get to enjoy the victory.
Because of the internal rot we talked about with the nine-rank system.
Exactly. That system empowered the aristocratic families, and one family in particular, the Sima clan, used it to perfection.
The Sima clan.
Sima Yi was a brilliant, endlessly patient military strategist who served the Cao family for decades. But slowly, methodically, he and his sons, Sima Shi and Sima Zhao, infiltrated the highest levels of the military and civil bureaucracy.
They just took it over from the inside.
They launched internal coups, purged loyalists to the Cao family, and gradually reduced the Wei emperors to helpless puppets.
They did to the Cao family exactly what Cao Cao had done to the last Han emperor.
It is history repeating itself with terrifying precision. In 266 AD, Sima Zhao's son, Sima Yan, takes the final step. He forces the puppet Wei emperor to abdicate and establishes his own dynasty, the Jin dynasty.
So it's the Jin dynasty now.
Yes. It is this new Jin dynasty, commanded by the Sima family, that spends the next 14 years building a massive fleet in the conquered territory of Shu.
And they go after Wu.
In 280 AD, they sail that fleet down the Yangtze River, shatter the defenses of eastern Wu, and force the surrender of its tyrannical final ruler, Sun Hao.
Wow.
The Three Kingdoms period ends, but the victors are not the families who started the war.
Okay, let's step back. Because we just walked through the cold, hard historical facts of the era. Wei was an absolute economic juggernaut that dominated the continent. Shu was a marginal, geographically isolated state, and the Sima family ruthlessly stole the ultimate victory.
Those are the facts, yes.
But that is not how the world remembers this era. If you ask anyone in East Asia today about the Three Kingdoms, they don't talk about the nine-rank system or the Sima family's administrative genius.
No, they don't.
They talk about heroes and villains. Why? Because of a book written a millennium later.
The Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
Written in the 14th century during the Ming Dynasty, attributed to an author named Luo Guanzong. I really want to emphasize the scale of this book. It is a behemoth. We are talking about 800,000 words, 120 chapters, featuring nearly 1,000 named characters.
It's a massive undertaking.
It uses the 3rd century historical text, Records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shou, as its skeleton, but it weaves in centuries of poetry, folklore, and regional operas to flesh out the narrative.
The Qing Dynasty historian Zhang Shucheng famously analyzed the novel and provided a perfect formula for its composition. He said the book is 7 parts fact and 3 parts fiction.
7 parts fact, 3 parts fiction. I look at this like modern Hollywood movies that flash based on a true story before the opening credits.
That's a very good analogy.
When you watch one of those movies, you know the major dates are correct. You know the battle happened and you know who won. But the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the dramatic one-on-one sword duels in the rain, that's pure Hollywood.
Absolutely.
What is that 3 parts fiction? actually accomplish for a reader who is hundreds of years removed from the events?
Well, it accomplishes something history textbooks often fail to do.
Yeah.
It creates an emotional reality.
An emotional reality.
Yes. While the exact dialogue and the theatrical duels between generals are invented, the underlying logic of the era is incredibly authentic. The desperate social conditions, the complex political maneuvering, and the psychological weight of the decisions, those are deeply true to the period.
Oh, it makes it relatable.
The fiction serves to breathe life into the dry, bureaucratic records, transforming these distant historical figures into profoundly relatable human beings facing impossible moral choices.
But that fictionalization also introduces a massive, undeniable bias into the cultural memory.
It certainly does.
The novel is intensely pro-Shu. Liu Bei, the founder of Shu, is romanticized as this virtuous, benevolent ruler who constantly weeps out of compassion for his suffering people.
He's the ultimate good guy.
Meanwhile, Cao Cao, who historically was a brilliant poet, a master strategist, and a highly effective administrator who actually stabilized the North, is cast as a treacherous, ruthless, cartoonish villain.
He is the quintessential Machiavellian antagonist of Chinese literature.
But we have to ask why Luo Guanzong shifted the narrative so drastically. Why villainize the historical victor?
It's all about politics.
Right. If you were living in the Jin dynasty, which immediately followed the Three Kingdoms, Wei was viewed as the legitimate successor to the Han.
Because the Jin had to legitimize Wei. Think about it. If Wei's usurpation of the Han was illegitimate, then Jin's usurpation of Wei was also illegitimate.
Oh, okay. So they had to say Wei was the good guy to justify their own rule.
Exactly. But by the time the novel is written in the 14th century Ming Dynasty, the political philosophy of the empire had evolved.
Okay, ELI 5, for someone who isn't steeped in Chinese philosophy, what does that shift actually look like? What is the difference between a Confucian ideal and ruthless pragmatism in this context?
Okay, ruthless pragmatism, which Cao Cao historically embodied, argues that results are the only thing that matters. If you have to brutally execute 1,000 innocent people to stabilize a province and secure a food supply, you do it.
Because state stability is the ultimate good.
Right. But the Confucian ideal, which the Ming Dynasty heavily promoted, and which the novel projects onto Liu Bei, argues that a ruler's right to govern derives entirely from his virtue and his humane governance.
So it's about being a good person.
A true Confucian monarch would rather lose a tactical advantage than abandon his people or compromise his moral integrity. The Ming audience wanted a hero whose authority came from his goodness, not just his military might.
And that reframing completely reshaped the cultural legacy of East Asia. The sources frequently compare the impact of this novel to Shakespeare's impact on English literature.
It really is on that level.
It isn't just a book, it's the cultural groundwater. It spawned countless operas and shadow puppet plays. Today, it's the basis for massive global video game franchises. The names of these warlords, Guan Yu, Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang, are literally household names across Asia.
Idioms based on their fictionalized exploits are used in daily business conversations even now.
That is amazing.
It is arguably the most widely read historical novel in late imperial and modern China. It took a chaotic, terrifying century of bloody civil war and transformed it into a timeless meditation on loyalty, strategy, brotherhood, and the cyclical, inevitable nature of history.
Which is summed up in the famous opening line, right?
Yes. The famous opening line establishes the grand philosophical theme: the empire, long divided, must unite, long united, must divide.
Which perfectly sums up the monumental journey we've taken today, from the heights of the Han to the ashes of the Three Kingdoms. Thank you to the listeners for tuning into the Deep Dive.
If I can leave you with one final thought to explore, it revolves around this concept of legitimacy. The Han Dynasty physically collapsed, but its idea, that unified architectural foundation, was so powerful that every warlord fought and died simply to claim its ghost. Yet, because of the romance of the Three Kingdoms, modern readers almost universally root for the legitimate underdog, Shu Han, rather than the pragmatic, powerful victors of Wei and Jin.
It really makes you ponder what it says about human nature. Why is it that across cultures and centuries, we would so much rather immortalize a beautiful, doomed ideal than celebrate a messy, ruthless, successful reality? Explore that tension on your own. Keep diving, and we'll see you next time.